And in the chat, he's just put the link for the handout. So please take a moment, if you have not already, to download the handout, which we will, as usual, be projecting on the screen as well. It's fitting today, as we finish the class, that the Israeli Prime Minister is taking an historic trip. In a matter of hours, Prime Minister Bennett will be flying to the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, for the first time ever. The Israeli Prime Minister is visiting that country, which was an extension of the Abraham Accords passed that some people think has changed, or maybe it hasn't changed. Has it not? We'll explore that a little bit. Has it changed the nature of Israel's place in the region, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? One wonders, and it's part of our speculation about the future. But definitely worth watching the coverage, if you can, after our class, of what happens on his visit, what is said, what might he do? And that's one of many questions that we have for today, which we'll share with you now, our agenda, which will be a very quick review of what we've done over the first 4 classes, and then looking ahead to the future possibilities around the conflict, around what other politicians who we haven't talked about might be key players in the future, and some demographic numbers and trends and questions, all worth thinking about in terms of the future of Israeli politics. So lessons from the past and looking to the future. And as you can see, the journey we've taken from Israeli politics to the economy, to what it means to join a coalition and stay in it, and those tough moments for some small parties, to the role of religion and state that we looked at last time, to finally broadly bringing those themes together to look at the present and possibilities for the future.
Yep. Sorry, just trying to get my.
All right.
There we go.
So as a very quick visual review, we've taken 4 images from our first 4 classes as a reminder of the journey we've taken together on Israeli politics. Class 1 about coalition building, and you see the picture of Mansour Abbas, one of the key kingmakers of this unusual coalition that's come together in the current Israeli government. Second is how to build a budget. And you may recall we looked at Meretz at the top, the left-wing party, Naftali Bennett's Yamina, and Shas as a few examples of what are their budget priorities and how did it play out in the recent budget that passed. Third, what does it mean to stay in the coalition? And again, an image from Meretz, and thinking about some of those issues where Meretz being in the coalition, but may have moments where it does not agree with policies done by certain ministers or direction of the government. Does it stay in the coalition? Does it not? Does it protest? What should Meretz do? Being one of those questions that will definitely remain over the coming months and years. And then finally, religion and politics, and that image of a woman at the wall that we talked about, in the role that that plays still in Israeli politics today. So all reminders, and you'll hear touch points on all of those images as we go forward. We did want to take a moment to pick up on one important question mentioned last time that we've not spent a lot of time in this class, which is Prime Minister Netanyahu's trial and the corruption charges and where that goes. Over the past few weeks, there have been some would argue explosive, really charged testimony against Prime Minister Netanyahu and what it means. Just before we got on, I saw another symbolic moment in which members of Netanyahu's family, his wife and kids, will no longer have the same security, the same chauffeur to drive them around. Another symbol of perhaps the beginning of the Netanyahu family receding to the scene for a time. Will it be forever? Will he make a comeback? One of our questions we'll talk about.
Although the rally last night might speak otherwise, so.
That's a good point, right? Exactly. So we'll play out all those possibilities. Now, one thing we can see in the quote here, one initiative that's taken place in this government is around term limits. Prime Minister Netanyahu became the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history, and you can see the quote here from the Justice Minister Gideon Sa'ar about the idea of potential term limits. Prolonged rule of one person is a harmful thing. In the face of the dangers of excessive concentration of power and the resulting corruption, we offer a better and more balanced arrangement. So there's some momentum. It has not passed fully yet, but a lot of conversation. Should Israel pass a law which term limits prime ministers to prevent in the future someone serving as long? And some people would argue that that's not been great for Israeli democracy to have someone be in office for such a long time, whatever party they represent. So that's one trend to watch. Will this law pass? If it does, how does it impact Israeli politics in the future? But with that, I'm going to turn the floor back over to Yoni, and we're going to do a little bit of look back into the past of other times in which we've had power-sharing governments. Certainly not quite as complex as the 8 parties we see today, but definitely some interesting moments of the past of when there was a national unity government. What might be learned from those past examples that might inform how we look at the present one? and the future of Israeli politics. Yoni.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. We're first going to look at one example, in fact, the only example that we have in Israeli history of a power-sharing government that lasted all 4 years. And so we're going to take a peek at that. And really what I would encourage everyone to think about as we're going through this slice of history is, in what ways does it help us better think about the coalition we have today? What are some of the lessons that we might draw from it? Does it give us hope for this current coalition? Does it make us nervous about the current coalition? Or does it shed no light at all? It was just a very different time. So those are some questions to think about. And then just quickly to frame where this is all going to go after we're done looking at this bit of history, we're then going to be looking at the Israeli future. Who are some of the future stars? And then, of course, looking at some of the demographic trends going on in Israel as well. So that's what's to come. All right, but before we look to the future, let's, as any good historian would tell you, we need to first understand where we've been. So let's take a look at the only power-sharing government to actually last all 4 years. Our friends Shimon Peres on the right and Yitzhak Shamir on the left. So basically, what happened was in 1984, and we'll spell out what the context was of that in a few moments. But first, what basically happened in that election was a remarkable thing. So you can see, looking at the numbers, that Shimon Peres, who ran as the top slated candidate on what was called alignment, what we call labor, is basically a combination of various left of center labor-oriented parties called alignment, received 44 votes, and Shamir, who was the head of the Likud, who actually had taken over just a couple of years before, after Menachem Begin had quit. So Shamir now runs on his own, or his own volition, as the head of the Likud. And so they are close to even, although Peres does have a few more. The problem was, we're not going to go through all the iterations here. If you add up all the parties that are center left and the party or far left and the parties that are center right and far right, they actually came out to a dead even 60-60 split. And so forming a government was going to be next to impossible. So rather than dissolve the thing and start again, and I'll go into why they decide not to do that in a moment, they instead decide to go into a power sharing agreement in which Shimon Peres was going to take the first half, and then basically around Rosh Hashanah, symbolically it worked out very nicely, around Rosh Hashanah of 1986, they would then officially resign, and Yitzhak Shamir would then take over. It was a remarkable moment for lots of reasons, including that they were going to be trying this experiment, but also that for lots of reasons, both Peres as prime minister and Shamir as prime minister were for many Israelis unthinkable. Shamir in particular, because Shamir had a long history for what many Israelis thought of as having been a part of the most famous Israeli terrorist organization known as Lehi, or the Stern Gang, and so the fact that he became prime minister was even a step further than Begin. But in any event, this was a truly remarkable moment, and we're going to dig into that now. All right, so the context of the moment was a twofold set of crises that were going on in Israel at the time. The first most obvious one to Israelis was the economy, something that we can relate to now, inflation, although this inflation in Israel in 1984 puts our inflation to shame. They were at 445% inflation by the time the election took place. And so you can see here they have a 10,000 shekel note, 5,000 shekel note, and so basically buying goods and whatever it is what people needed to survive was getting really, really hard. So that was problem number one. And then problem number two was the ongoing war in Lebanon, and what seemed to be not just the war in Lebanon, but things starting to spiral out of control domestically as well. And so not only did you have problems in Lebanon, Israeli loss of life, and then on top of it, a major scandal in Sabra Shatila, where Palestinians were massacred largely as Israelis looked on, and one of the great Israeli generals, I'm completely blanking on his name, became prime minister.
Ariel Sharon?
Sharon,
Thank you,
yeah.
Sharon. That was just me having a brain freeze. Was in deep trouble for having watched on as that massacre took place. But then in Israel, things start to get really bad as well. Protesting largely from the left, and here's an image from one of the protests where Emil Grunzweig, you could see his fourth from the left, this is moments before he would be killed during this particular protest, when one of the counter protesters threw a grenade into their protest. And so this, of course, leaves Israelis feeling deeply at sea, both economically and from a security standpoint, and from an internal security standpoint as well. And so it's in that context that the election takes place, and that they decide to go into a power sharing arrangement. So, how did it turn out? That's what we're going to look at next. And again, I invite you to be thinking about ways in which there are parallels to what we have today, and ways that we can think about what is hopeful about this, or maybe not hopeful, and in what ways is it just a different situation. So be thinking about those questions as we move forward. So the first thing is what Shimon Peres as the prime minister is able to do, and it's a remarkable thing, and it's possible that only Shimon Peres would have been able to pull it off, was to completely, basically redo the Israeli currency and to end the inflationary cycle, and to get it back down to about 25% as it had been before. You could see on the chart here that shortly after, by 1987, inflation's back down to where it had been previously. Now, just have you note, by the way, it's fascinating. We can discuss this if you want. Look at the faces and the arrangement of the 10,000, 5,000 shekel, and you can look at the faces and arrangement of the 5 shekel and the 10 shekel. If you want a chance to look back again, 5,000. They literally just lopped off zeros. They kept the same bill, except for the zeros at the end. So why that symbolically may have mattered is an interesting question, but that was true of all of the other bills as well. This is not what the currency looks like today, but that was for a few years after the way things looked. Now, the reason I said that this is possibly only that only Peres could have pulled it off is because the way he manages to get the inflationary cycle down, was by one, convincing Histadrut to take a pretty significant wage cut. It's about 33% wage cut that Histadrut, just to remind you, is the major labor organization that not just encompasses most workers in Israel, but then also some of the most important banks and building organizations, hospitals, healthcare system, etc., all under the Histadrut. So they take a massive wage cut, and also wage freezes. He manages to convince his other businesses, not in the Histadrut, to take wage freezes also. So it's possible that only from the left could they have made that possible arrangement. But that said, by 1987, the inflation rate was down to about 20-ish% again, and so the Israeli economy starts to improve. The other thing that the Israeli populace was deeply concerned about was the war in Lebanon, and that Peres, along with Shamir, they managed to tamp down by removing the Israeli troops from Lebanon, and to really de-escalate the crisis. It wouldn't stop. Situation in Lebanon continued, largely focused in the southern area of Lebanon, but now it was much more about Israel dealing with sporadic terrorist strikes, etc., from South Lebanon, rather than an ongoing crisis and war in Lebanon itself. So both of those things seem to tamp down. So What about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? We've talked about this. We're going to talk about it again today. What role did it play in the government? To a large extent, the government really tried to marginalize, to sideline the conflict. And in many ways, it was symbolized by what happened again during Peres's time as the prime minister, through what became famously known as the number 300 bus affair. So what happened there? So four PFLP, Palestinian terrorists, boarded the number 300 Egged bus and held it hostage. They demanded the release of Palestinian prisoners, and through a complicated set of negotiations and then a raid on the bus, the Shin Bet killed two of the terrorists and then managed to capture the other two and drag them off the bus. And this is actually the one photo that we have of the terrorist Shin Bet surrounding one of the terrorists here. It's published worldwide, and the reason it becomes a major publication, this particular photo, is because of what happens next. It's unclear exactly what happens, but they're taken out to a field, the two Palestinian terrorists, and they are killed. Whether they're killed by the Shin Bet or others who had the Shin Bet let them kill them, who had been surrounding the bus and watching the events and then surrounded and killed the terrorists, is not entirely clear. But by the time the event is over, the two Palestinians who had been captured by the Shin Bet and were in their custody were also dead. So the Attorney General decides that this is, from the evidence that they had, required an investigation. And they sought to investigate the Shin Bet to find out exactly what had happened. At that point, Prime Minister Peres starts getting pressure from other cabinet ministers to shut down the investigation. And effectively, he manages to do so. And so the investigation into the Shin Bet by the Attorney General is in fact stopped. The Attorney General ends up quitting. And polls basically showed that the Israeli population said, good, we didn't actually want this to become a major issue, and it is effectively pushed to the side. One last story, and then we want to hear from you. The final story actually takes place when Shimon Peres is now the foreign minister, no longer the prime minister. And again, just to remind you, at Rosh Hashanah, or during the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the 10 days in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Peres officially resigns as the prime minister, and Shamir takes over as the serving prime minister of Israel. So, what is the final story? The final story is yet seemingly another example of ministers operating behind the scenes, possibly without their prime minister aware of what they're doing. Peres, who is now the foreign minister, goes off to London, this is in 1987, to meet with King Hussein of Jordan, largely brokered by the British government. It was at the house of one of the lords in London, who was a Jewish. They meet at his villa, and with under the auspices of the Thatcher government, they broker what becomes known, or at least behind the scenes, as the London Agreement, whereby basically the agreement was going to be that under the auspices, the watchful eye of King Hussein, that the Israelis would begin negotiations with the Palestinians. That was the agreement. That was the plan. Word gets back to Shamir that this had been going on. Shamir says, "What? I had no idea. This is unacceptable." And he puts the kibosh on the agreement. And Peres tries desperately to reignite the agreement again, but with Shamir saying no, it's just not possible. And shortly after that, I'm not claiming that they are related, but shortly after that, the Second Intifada the second intifada, sorry, the first intifada, the first intifada begins. And the way Peres saw it, and again, historians debate this, but Peres sees this, if we're looking at the top quote, that we could have saved ourselves in the Palestinian 6 years of intifada and the loss of so much human life had the former head of the Likud run government not undermined the agreement I had worked out with King Hussein of Jordan, said Shimon Peres in 1993. So what had begun as a relatively, not only peaceful, but in some ways friendly co-run government ended with the prime minister and the foreign minister, once prime minister Peres, now deeply at odds. But that all said, it went all 4 years of government. So the question that we pose to you is, are any of these helpful forerunners to understanding our power sharing arrangement today? So with that, I will stop sharing for a few moments, and I'd love to hear from you. Of course, first, if there are questions, those, and otherwise, love to hear you weigh in on this particular historical analogy, anything that we can learn from it. So Paula, why don't we start with you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I'm thinking that the parallel of the negotiation around the Palestinian issue these days with the government might be the issue of the settlements, that one leader makes a unilateral move about that, the other is opposed to it. It's a place where there is conflict, and I see that as at least a loose parallel.
Yep, absolutely. And John and I actually right before our class were just talking about a really interesting move that was made by the Interior Minister. We're going to actually talk a bit more about her a little later in the class. Her name is Ayelet Shaked, who it was just revealed gave about 500,000 shekels, and real money is not a whole lot of money, but still symbolically may be important, to what was called the development of municipal programs in Hebron, which is one of the most controversial Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And so it may signal that the Interior Ministry is now moving to set up official links between the Israeli government and municipal services between the government and Hebron, which would be the first time since 1967 that this has happened. So that could be one example, Paula, of what you're talking about. Yeah, absolutely. So we'll see how the government from the prime minister on down responds to that move. It's going to be a very interesting set of weeks ahead. Other thoughts? Yes, Rick. Rick, you're up and muted.
You can hear me now, right?
Yes, we can.
All right, just 2 quick points. One, the West Bank settlements, the settlers believe that they're living on Israeli territory, not Palestinian territory. They can vote. They're protected by the IDF. They believe they're in Israel. And if you talk to them about moving back to the regular part of Israel, they're not interested. On the other hand, there was a deal, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, where certain pieces of the West Bank would be returned to Israel and other pieces of Israel would be put into the West Bank. And the result would be that the Palestinians could have a congruous territory that they could all get to, and the Israelis would have a certain amount of security. And there was this deal, but there was no, what's the word for it? No political will on either side to make it happen. And my question is there any additional political will now?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, so you've anticipated what we're going to be doing shortly after we examine the past, is to actually look at the current coalition and how the current coalition either currently is or will be thinking about the conflict, and we're going to actually look at 3 different ways in which the current coalition may be looking at the conflict. So your question, Rick, is anticipating something we're going to be getting to momentarily. So if it's okay, we're going to put it aside for a few moments, but I promise we're going to come right back to it. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely, of course. David, yes.
Yes, what certainly strikes me as a success of that power sharing government between Perez and Shamir was the ability to get inflation under control. And I would think that if Shamir had not been there and had the political courage to ask for those controls on wages, that it would have been very hard if it came from the other side. And so having him present there, I think, was a great success in being able to get inflation under control so rapidly.
Yeah, I think you're making a really, really important point, and this is something I think that we've seen in other places too. Who is the person at the helm of any particular given moment can make all the difference in whether or not the change can actually occur. So, for example, right, in this instance, having the labor leader, Perez, be the one to go to the Histadrut. If there was anybody in Israel who was the face of labor and union, Perez would have been the guy. So the fact that it's him going to Histadrut and saying, we got to do this, I think was absolutely critical. Just, for example, in the same way that it was when Begin was the one who went to the Egyptians and said, let's talk about peace. That made all the difference as well. And so who is going to be asking for what and in the current coalition may make all the difference. So if Bennett is the one who starts asking for maybe some things that move us towards a more towards peace, that he has been somebody who has not necessarily done that in the past, he might have more credibility. We'll see. Mm-hmm. So David, you're making a really important point. Absolutely. Yeah. Judy.
I want to mention a difference and then leave a question on the table. Of course, the really salient difference is that there was such parity between the 2 leaders in that earlier coalition, and the one that Israel has now is nothing like that. It's just this crazy assortment of parties, and the small ones have a lot of power, to veto what's going on. All right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the question I want to ask, and maybe you'll answer it as we go along, and you just mentioned something that the Interior Minister did. I kind of don't get how these ministers, and Benny Gantz is the other big example, just go and do things without the approval of the government. I mean, they're not the government, they're not the prime minister in particular. And, how can, maybe this is a convenient cover, or maybe it really is some defect in how the power is shared among the partners.
Yeah. So Judy, you're raising a really, really interesting question, which I think we should probably divide into 2 buckets. The first one is structurally, how is it possible for that to happen? Just from like a structural / legal perspective, how can that happen? And then the other bucket is the political one. How can it be allowed to happen? So from a structural perspective, the ministries, in America, what we call the cabinet officers and the departments have enormous power. They have enormous power. And, under the Israeli, I guess, for lack of a better term, constitutional system, they can do things. So, for example, looking back at the AG who wanted to investigate was the 300 bus affair, could have had the Israeli government not actually put a kibosh on it, could have done that on their own. And the same thing here, and the same thing with Gantz, who is the defense minister, whose portfolio it is to oversee the territories. They are legally, structurally allowed to do those things on their own. Now, politically, it gets much more complicated. And John, you can weigh in here, but I can tell you, so when John and I think about the classes and prep these things, it's a question we actually have come to several times in our conversations, and we've sort of asked each other, like, how is this politically possible? And I'm not sure that we've come to any resolution in answering those questions, other than to say that it can get really, really sticky and complicated for a prime minister to either own it, because if he knew about it and it turns out it's unpopular, he's in trouble, But if he throws the minister under the bus and says, "Oh, I had no idea," then it looks like the prime minister is not in control and has no idea what's going on in his own government. So it's really, really complicated. John, I don't know if you want to jump in from a political perspective, but
Sure.
yeah, question.
If you think about the actions of each of these cabinet ministers and what they're doing, it makes sense for them to do it, to say, we're in this coalition that's a compromise for us, but we're delivering for you, for our constituency, for what we want. And it may be about them positioning for a future government. Now, you're right. It does lead for a big question. Why doesn't Bennett crack down more? And I think he has to make a calculation too, which is it worth cracking down so much that the whole thing falls and he's no longer prime minister or not? Like, when does he make a stand? When does he not as a new leader? I think he's very new as a prime minister. It's unlike Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has huge following, both within political allies, loyalists in the country, who did for a long time. Prime Minister Bennett became the prime minister with 7 seats, 7 out of 120. Never been someone so small. So I think he has a delicate balance. And it seems to me a parallel to American politics. While this is difficult, notice what he's doing today. He's flying to the United Arab Emirates to say, look, I'm a statesman and I can represent the country and look and deliver and continue the promise of what it means to be a leader, perhaps to get to boost his ratings at his home as much as it's practical for Israeli leader to want to have such an accomplishment. So for me, at the end of the day, it kind of does make sense, given the nature of Israeli politics and the system, that everyone is pushing as hard as they can, right? And now, will they push to a point where the system breaks, where the coalition falls? That'll come to when we get into our stars, whether for each of these individual political parties, do they want the thing to fall? So, for example, a recent poll said Gideon Sa'ar, the justice minister we mentioned earlier, election happens today, his party be out of the government. So he certainly, I think, is one who doesn't want the whole thing to collapse. Versus others who might pick up. Gantz is actually one who's shown that his numbers are ticking up. Is that why he's pushing more? Because if the thing falls, okay, let's have another election. I'm willing to go to bat for that. My party may be positioned differently. So I think that's all part of the calculus.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'd add to John's analysis is that it's really interesting to watch how the prime minister responds when the ministers go off and do their own thing and who their audiences are. Because what was fascinating about the Gantz situation, and just to remind everybody what Judy was referring to, is Gantz, in the span of basically a week, first announced that 6 Palestinian NGOs, non-governmental organizations, were now going to be labeled as terrorist organizations, and then basically said that we're now opening areas in the West Bank for future construction that had not before been, or for a long time, been open for construction. So in the span of a week did that. And it wasn't until the Americans, the State Department, came out and said, what's going on here, that Bennett said, wait a second. I don't think I knew what was going on here. So his audience in that case were the Americans. And so it seems like, one audience being the Israelis, we're not going to shut that down. We're going to allow it to continue. Whereas to the Americans, he's willing to throw Gantz under the bus. So he's, I think, in some ways trying, to add to what John was saying, thinking about his own political hide, bifurcating his responses, trying to have his cake and eat it too. Whereas you compare it, interestingly, to 1984, when it was clear to Peres that his attorney general was doing something he didn't want, that the public didn't want him to do, he shut it down. And so depending on who the audience is and what their own needs are in the moment, I think John's exactly right. That's a good way to read it. I'm not sure if Roberta, are you up there? David, what's up?
Well, this is also an answer to a question I raised maybe the last class, which is how does a parliamentary democracy get anything done? The answer is, even though you're describing, what might be called dysfunction, the answer is lots of people in power feel free to do things and can get away with it under certain circumstances.
Yeah, and I've read analysts say that this is the epitome of democracy, that you allow multiple sources within your government to act, and then we're going to see how the public responds to it. And if the public likes it, then we continue going as is. And if the public doesn't like it, then you start to see the pushback from within the government itself. So it's a very active and fluid democratic government. I'm putting obviously a more optimistic spin on it, but that is how some analysts end up seeing it. So, or you could see it as chaos one way or the other. But yes, David, I think you're right, and I'm glad we're able to tie that back to your question. You're exactly right. Yeah. So with that said, just a little bit of history for you, for everyone to start thinking about our current coalition now. We're going to continue thinking about this as we move forward in today's class. But with that, we are going to, where did we leave off? We are here. Yep, there we go. Let's see, can we make it move forward? There we go. So the question that Rick raised earlier is, okay, so in our current government, what we have seen to a large extent has been the Israeli government really focusing on the economy, or at least that have been their big moves. And even when things relate to the conflict or other things, they tend to do things through the economy. Is this government going to tackle the conflict? And if so, how will this government do that? So John is going to pick up with that part of the story now.
Thank you. So as we come to the end of the class, we like to give suggestions of things to read, to think about. And if I would put at the top of the list this book by Micha Goodman, who is a scholar at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, among other roles he plays in Israeli society, because this book is probably the most read book among the Israeli political class, as much of Israeli society. So first came out in Hebrew, now in English, and many have read, called Catch 67, which clearly is a play off of the famous novel Catch 22, being in this stuck place. And Micha Goodman is trying to think about how to get out of the stuck place. What is the stuck place? It's about how to think about the conflict. So I'll give a very quick summary of the book, and we'll use that to introduce a few models, the ways in which Israeli politicians think about the conflict, and the way in which the current government argues it's thinking about the conflict, and whether that argument is true to the reality of what they're doing on the ground. In many ways, Catch 67, he's saying we're replaying a debate that came out in the cabinet a week after the Six-Day War, where two things are believed by the majority of Israelis at the same time. On the one hand, Israel has to leave the West Bank, at least some part of it, some part of the land acquired. And at the same time, Israel can't leave, has to stay in Judea and Samaria. Those are the arguments of left and right. And you poll Israelis, both are true at the same time. Well, how is that possible? So he unpacks a little bit, what are these arguments? And he thinks about a third path. So first, if you see in the summary, I'm going to look at the one on the right first, where it says why Israel must stay in Judea and Samaria. So notice the terms being used. I'm using the terms intentionally. On the right, Judea and Samaria, the historic names for parts of what the international community calls the West Bank. Why stay there? The reason is, in part, the religious connections to the land. These are religious, holy, important sites, whether it's places like Jenin and Nablus, where Joseph's tomb is, or it could be Jericho, the oldest city in the world, or it could be, again, Hebron, mentioned earlier, a lot of different places that are so historic and important, where the name Jew comes from, Judea. So we have to say for the religious historic ties. That's where Jewish history happened. Many won't want to leave for the economic incentives given to stay in these places. Now, that's the thing that many analysts think could be the most overcome with incentives. Would people move across the Green Line to other parts of Israel? Likely, but for now, many people go to these places for economic incentives, which have been part of the system for decades. And then finally, in terms of managing Israel's security, Israel, think about its history of the 48 and the 67 war, 73, among others, having the security area buffer. Some military analysts would argue Israel can't leave, has to stay. Those are the typical arguments you hear from the right about religion, history, economics, and security. What are the arguments made from the Israeli left on this question? That there is a moral objection to occupying militarily another people. This just can't stand. It's against this idea of a Jewish character of the state. Well, you don't want that to happen. And the Jewish character of the state argument actually goes to demographics too. If Israel was to become one society, one person, one vote fully, then the demographic character of Israel would be in the Jewish majority, the 75% Jewish majority, which is there today, would be at risk. It would be better for Israel to retain its character by helping to cultivate some sort of Palestinian state and withdraw from these territories. Also on the left are the economic costs of security are tremendous. And then finally, keeping this a democratic state, but also the international pressures not to have it. Now, if you go back to the top of the columns, the right is basically saying we can manage the conflict. We don't have to do much about it. We can manage it. We've been managing it for years, keeping the peace. Not much to be done here. And I'll unpack that argument more in a minute. And on the left, they're saying, no, this is an existential crisis. We have to solve the conflict. The left is arguing today. Well, Mika Goodman comes up with a third term. Shouldn't try to manage it, shouldn't try to solve it. You should try to shrink it, shrink the conflict. And you can hear Naftali Bennett use those exact words and terms, which we will talk about in Model 3 at the end. But I'm going to take a minute now just to briefly walk through Models 1 and 2 in more detail. So let's look at Model 1. You have a map on the left of Oslo 2, the second phase of the Oslo negotiations that was trying to at least take interim steps, perhaps towards a two-state solution. And you see the geography there and a shaking of the hands. That was an effort to moving towards solving the conflict. Can we resolve the conflict by which there would be two states for the two peoples, and the whole Oslo negotiations was based on that premise. Go to the next slide. But is this model still viable? We are here now over a quarter of a century after the shaking of the hands, and a lot of people question whether, as this is another website we'll invite you to look at carefully after this course. Look what it's called. Is peace still possible? That's probably the big question of the day. Is it possible to come to an agreement based on the 4 final status issues identified by Oslo are also complicated? How do you draw borders? How do you ensure security for all of the parties? How do you deal with the question of Jerusalem, what it will look like in the future, and the question of Palestinian refugees? All are still on the table and very complicated and not easy to solve. So some people believe Oslo, there's no chance for a two-state solution. The Oslo process is dead. Others think in certain circumstances it can be revived. But we know, if you look at least politically in Israeli society, since the Second Intifada, so now we're going almost 2 decades, it doesn't have a lot of political traction at this particular moment. It's not trying to keep it alive for a future date, but in the present moment, sadly, it is not very much in the cards. Almost everyone is in agreement among the Israeli political spectrum on that point. So that's to solve the problem challenge. On the right, this has been more of, I would say, the political class, and certainly under Prime Minister Netanyahu's leadership, has been the approach. This can be managed. And why do they argue to manage the conflict? They would say, we live in a very unstable region, Israel. We have experienced terrorism, and now you can see in the book by Netanyahu from years ago. We're in a region where the Arab Spring happened, where there was tremendous instability in all of our neighbors and beyond. This is not a moment to try to advocate for peace. This is a moment where Israel has to think about its security first and not try to make big initiatives, with some exception, with the exception of the Abraham Accords recently passed, with certain partners who are ready, whether it's the UAE or Bahrain or Morocco, who are ready for peace, who are ready for economic diplomatic peace, to have some sense of recognition, exchange of business ties and diplomatic ties. Perhaps let's solve that first. If we can make peace with our neighbors, then we can turn to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this has been a debate in this conflict over time. Do you start with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict first, and that will lead to peace with Israel and its neighbors? Or do you do the reverse? Do you focus on making peace with neighbors first? And that will help to solve the conflict. Going back to peace with Egypt in 79 or Jordan in 94, peace with the neighbors. In each of those cases, they thought maybe that would set up the peace with the Palestinians, or at least a process. Didn't prove to be true. Once again, the thesis being tested, peace with broader neighbors. How will that change the dynamics in the region? Prime Minister Netanyahu argued for years this is the case, and I think he will say, as a signature accomplishment he will be proud of, whatever happens for the rest of his political career, will be these Abraham Accords. Will he be right for the future? That's part what we don't know. We'll all have to see what unfolds. So what does Naftali Bennett do differently? And so he has this idea about shrinking the conflict, where he says, okay, I know it can't be solved. He definitely is on the right. And he's more in the camp of managing, but he's asking the question that Micha Goodman asks. Are there steps that can be taken that separate the two conflicting parties, Israelis and Palestinians, from one another? Maybe doing things like reducing the number of checkpoints, maybe increasing economic opportunity for Palestinians, and maybe doing things like the video we're about to watch. So this is a video that Naftali Bennett made long before he was a prime minister, but was in Israeli politics, thinking about what might the future of a future solution, so to speak, or at least an interim solution look like? And I think it's one example you could see as shrinking the conflict. How viable it is, we can debate and discuss. But let's watch now in Naftali Bennett's own words and through these images what he imagines a future solution might be. So with that, I'll ask Yoni to put up the video, and then we will watch it together.
יש דברים שרובנו מבינים שכבר לא יקרו. הסופרנוז לא יחזרו לעונה נוספת, רמי קליינשטיין כבר לא יגדל אפרו, וגם הסכם שלום עם הפלסטינים לא יקרה. זה פשוט לא ריאלי. למה? הסיפור הוא די פשוט. הקמת מדינה פלסטינית על בסיס קווי 67 היא בלתי אפשרית, משום שהיא תסכן את מדינת ישראל. מבחינה ביטחונית, זה ישכפל את עזה לתוך יהודה ושומרון, מה שיגביר את ייצוא המתכת לתוך שטח ישראל. דבר שני, מאגרי המים שהמקור שלהם ביהודה ושומרון מספקים 50% ממי השתייה בישראל. גם מבחינה דמוגרפית, מדינה פלסטינית תהיה מגנט להגירה של מיליוני פליטים לתוך שטחי יהודה ושומרון. הלחץ הדמוגרפי על הקו הירוק ייצור כמות אדירה של מסתננים, שתגמד את ההסתננויות מאפריקה כיום. וישראל תאבד את הרוב שיש לה בין הירדן והים. בנוסף, בואו נזכור שמסביבנו יש עדיין כמה מדינות שלא ממש מתות עלינו. במקרה של מתקפה ממזרח, בקעת הירדן היא מחסום גיאוגרפי טבעי בגלל הפרשי הגובה. מנגד, סיפוח של כל יהודה ושומרון והקמת מדינה דו-לאומית תבטל את האופי של ישראל כמדינה יהודית. אז מה עושים? אפשר לא לעשות כלום ולקוות שהכל יסתדר מעצמו. הבעיה היא שבזה אנחנו מפקירים את הזירה ליוזמות פלסטיניות. ואפשר גם לעשות את מה שהציונות תמיד עשתה, לקחת את גורלנו בידינו. וכאן נכנסת תוכנית הסיפוח החלקי. היא לא תייצר גן עדן, אבל תשפר מאוד את המצב שלנו. המצב היום הוא כזה. יהודה ושומרון מחולקים לשטחי A, B ו-C. שטחי A ו-B נמצאים בשליטה פלסטינית. כאן גרים 97% מהפלסטינים. ושטחי C נמצאים בשליטה ישראלית. בשטח הזה גרים כל 350,000 המתיישבים היהודים ורק 48,000 פלסטינים. שטח C כולל גם את הנקודות החיוניות לביטחון ישראל. התוכנית היא לספח את שטח C לשטח מדינת ישראל. לפלסטינים יתאפשר שלטון עצמי בשטחים A ו-B, ורציפות תחבורתית תבטיח שכל תושב יוכל להגיע מכל מקום ביהודה ושומרון לכל מקום אחר בלי לראות מחסום צה"לי אחד. ל-48,000 הפלסטינים שחיים בשטח C תוצא אזרחות ישראלית, או אם יעדיפו, תושבות, כמו תושבי מזרח ירושלים. זה בקושי ידגדג את המאזן הדמוגרפי של מדינת ישראל, אבל יוציא את האוויר מהמפרשים של מי שמאשים אותנו באפרטהייד. הגבולות הנוכחיים עם ירדן ועזה יישארו, והשמירה אף תהודק, כדי למנוע חדירה של צאצאי פליטים פלסטינים וטרור. ישראל תזכה ליציבות מבחינה ביטחונית ודמוגרפית, ואף אחד לא יגורש מביתו. ומה יגיד העולם? העולם לא מכיר בריבונות הישראלית בירושלים, או ברמת הגולן. אז אפשר להוסיף לרשימה גם את שטחי C.
Yes, so we'll take a moment now to pause for some questions, thoughts, reactions to what you've seen, and clarification on manage, solve, shrink the conflict, and then we can unpack that together. So we'll start with Andy, please.
All right. I think the what Bennett was saying there is fairly common on the right. It's sort of a continuation of their policies. But what interested me is that he sort of admitted that a viable and successful and affluent Palestinian state would be a danger to Israel. You don't want them to be too well off.
Not too well off, although if you look at his op-eds, he definitely talks of believing that if some economic opportunity is created, that's going to lead to peace. You're right. It can't be too successful, and yet he also knows, and remember, he's coming as a businessman, from the software field, where he understands business ties and how they can lead to stability and prosperity. So I'll just add one piece. You notice in Bennett's video, he focused on population. We need to add the land percentages. So he's right. Population-wise, 97% of Palestinians live in areas A and B. A and B mean the big Palestinian cities like Ramallah, Jenin, Nablus, Jericho, and so on. But and then the villages that immediately surround them. Land-wise, that's 40% of the West Bank. 60% of the West Bank, very few Palestinians live, but that's where all the Jewish settlements are. So that's the deal he's really trying to strike here, is that basically no one really needs to move in his deal. Everyone can stay in their particular homes and hope for some success success and stability and get mostly what they want. And he said, even he understands it's a stability plan. This isn't going to solve anything, but it's going to put us in a better place. And I think if you listen to other principles there, it's similar to things that this government has said, not in every respect, but and we'll look for some examples of that, but in many respects, it comes from this kind of mindset.
I would add just one quick thing to John's analysis, and I think, Andy, this is not entirely what you're getting at, but I think that to some degree what Bennett is concerned about is a demography problem, which is that if the West Bank of the Palestinian areas become too affluent, too successful, it's going to attract, as one of the magnet piece, it's going to attract Arab populations from across the Middle East, and that is then going to enlarge the Palestinian population there, which will then swamp the Jewish population, and then you have a one person, one vote problem as a result of that. And so I think he wants to prevent that from happening. And in his mind, the way you prevent that is by annexing Area C, which can then put a block on the immigration coming from the other areas. So even if the Palestinians become affluent, which I think, as John is rightly pointing out, would be a good thing, because you don't want them suffering and then causing, stirring problems because of their suffering. That we can resolve the demographic problem, have them become affluent, and also resolve the demographic problem by annexing and then blocking immigration from coming in. So that's just another, I don't know, Andy, if that's a helpful set of responses, but that, yeah.
That's great. Paula.
My question is just a functional one. I had trouble reading the subtitles. There's like a black line over them.
Oh, sorry.
I'm wondering if that could be posted for reading later without, is there some way to eliminate that so I could go back and look at that?
Thank you. Yes, I think it was a function of the PowerPoint and just the way it was shared, but absolutely, you have the link in the PowerPoint. And that should not be there for you to watch it again.
So the PowerPoint will have a link to it where I could go directly
Yes.
without the black line. Okay, thank you.
It does, and I'm also going to put it into the chat now. So
Okay,
if you want to grab it and put it off to the side for later viewing, that's yeah.
Thanks.
Ellis, then I saw Rick, and then Bonnie. So Ellis next, please. Oh, Ellis, you're on mute. Sorry.
So my question is, the Arabs in A and B don't have the right to vote, correct?
They don't have the right to vote in the Israeli government. They have the right to vote for the Palestinian Authority leadership.
Right. But
there are
so
elections.
why would Israel be concerned if that population grows with immigration into that area? That would not swap out votes in Israel.
That's right. No, I think Bennett's concern is the growth in their population if this deal doesn't happen, is if there are growth in population in A, B, and C in all those areas as it currently exists.
No, I thought you were saying that if they become too economically successful, there'll be a increase in immigration into that area, and that will jeopardize the majority rule in Israel.
No,
Is that what you're saying?
No, that would not at all.
So what's the issue with immigration into A and B? I don't follow. What's the problem? What's the disadvantage to Israel if Arabs want to move into A and B?
So currently they can't. I mean, so so Israel has control over who can immigrate into these areas, and that's for security purposes, right? Now notice what he said about A and B. He said that they would be self-autonomous regions. It wasn't even clear that he's actually thinking about statehood fully. What would that look like? I think he's leaving the cards open on that. Are they autonomous and still somehow Israel oversees them? Are they autonomous and become part of a Jordanian confederation going back to the model that Yoni referenced, it's similar to the idea that Paris had with King Hussein years ago. That's actually unclear. And so I think one of the things that relates to immigration, this is one of the guarantees that Israel wants for whatever the deal is at the end of the day. Because when you look at Area C, it's not contiguous land. It's both the immediate borders of places that are not far from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and it's the border with the Jordan River. Because Israel's experience and remembering is not having security in the Jordan Valley in that river area goes back to their memories of 48, 67, 73, the key wars that it fought. And it does not want in any short-term period to lose any control over that. And that's why any of the deals that we know have come forward, there are provisions, for 10 years, Israel gets to keep security services, or maybe longer in some of those areas, because that's the big long-term concern, is who's really controlling the flow of people, of goods, militarily, otherwise, in that area. Because I think is the major concern there. Rick, and then I see other hands will go in order. Bonnie, Steve, followed by Judy. So Rick, please.
All right, I see two discrepancies. The first, the 48,000 Palestinians in Area C were offered residency.
Yep.
And they're deeded land for their homes. They'll turn around and say, oh, that works for today. Tomorrow, just like in East Jerusalem, the IDF will come in and take over our homes. It means nothing to us having Israeli residency. That's
right.
One point. The second point is about this idea that Ellis was talking about, how will the Palestinians overrule the Jews in Israel? Forget about the West Bank and all of this. We can plot the year, forgetting about the Palestinians and all this, we can plot the year when the number of voters in Israel will be a majority Arab. Okay, it's got nothing to do with the Palestinians. And if we look at that, Israel will be faced with the choice of a democracy or a Jewish state, but not both. So, I don't, blaming it on Palestinian immigration is not the point. It's got not much to do with it.
Well, look, both your points are fair critiques that many others would make of Bennett's plan. Absolutely, both. And I'll just add to your first point, the 48,000 is probably a pretty strong underestimate of the number of Palestinians. I think a more reasonable number is about double that, the number of Palestinians who actually live in Area C, which makes it even more complicated, besides the points that you raised. So that's right. Bonnie, please.
I find myself in part resonating to Bennett's plan, I think in large part because, and mind you, I'm a two-stater, in large part though, because the Palestinians in areas A and B would not have checkpoints. They would be able to, or presumably they'd be able to go between, they'd be able to go all over their area, if indeed that would be the point, because of course the checkpoints have been a major irritant, more than irritant, to the Palestinians, and a drag on Israeli economy and security because of all of the resources needed to patrol these checkpoints. But it does raise a couple of issues in my mind. First of all, what about Gaza? Now, it makes the Palestinian proto-state even more divided if you don't have Area C, because it'll be a little further away from Gaza than it is currently.
Yep.
And the other thing is the international community and the laws of occupation are that you don't annex territory that you quote conquer. And what will this do for Israel's standing in the world? I love the idea of creating a confederation between the Palestinian proto-state and Jordan, if Jordan would ever agree to that. They've been so reluctant to add more Palestinians to their midst. But if some way were presented to convince Jordan of the benefits of enlarging its own state, then perhaps that would be useful. So I'm really glad that you showed us this Bennett video. I hadn't heard about it before, and I think it's worth certainly discussing.
Thank you. And I think it's worth discussing because, again, it brings you into the mindset of Naftali Bennett, whether one agrees or disagrees. And it's people are not optimistic about Jordan wanting to take the deal. But again, who knows? Times could change. They have in the past been more interested. They don't seem to be now, but it's possible. And your point about the world, I don't think the international community would love this plan annexing anything. You're right. And you saw how flippantly Naftali Bennett dealt with that. The UN's calling, hang up on the UN, right? Okay. Because there are other places that we claim sovereignty over, like the Golan Heights and parts of Jerusalem. Yeah, the international community doesn't recognize. Okay, they won't recognize this either. But as he said, his belief is he's taking Israel's destiny into its own hands. And what's clear to me in this video is that he's really trying to speak to the political right, to say, don't think there's going to be a world in which we're going to get everything back. And that's a big shift. That's a shift from the past. That's a shift from past, going back to Jabotinsky original, that, yeah, all of Israel, every inch has to be a part of it. But Naftali Bennett is proposing and saying maybe there'll be some areas we won't get back, is, I think, part of the game he's playing here. Others could disagree. That's my sense.
One quick sense.
Yeah.
Just to add to I think the really important insights that Bonnie you were naming there, that the Jordanian option, i.e. the Jordanians playing a major role in this, actually, just to tie us back to the 1984 to 1988 time period, actually comes to an end in many ways in 1988 after the failure of the London Agreement. King Hussein said, you burned me once, I ain't gonna fall for this again. And he in 1988 relinquishes all claims of Jordan to the West Bank, says, done, I'm out. And so it's not to say that that is necessarily going to be forever, that Jordan says we're done dealing with the Palestinian question. But that was a major turning point in Jordan's relationship with Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So, and not accidentally, then shortly after that, Jordan makes its own peace treaty with Israel, independent of the Palestinian situation. So anyway, just to add that to the mix. So yes.
Thank you, Yoni. Steve, please.
Yeah, I had a couple of comments on the Jordanian issue. I mean, the Jordanians are a minority, I believe, in their own country today. Palestinians,
the Hashemites, yeah.
More Palestinian refugees than Jordanian Hashemite or whatever who are citizens. I don't know what status the Palestinians have, but you go to them. I've been in Amman, and it's wall to wall Palestinians.
Yes.
The question I had was about travel in and out of the West Bank or Gaza today. How do Palestinians who live in the West Bank go abroad? Is there an airport in the Palestinian territories? And with regard to immigration, if they blocked the Jordan Valley, couldn't the Palestinians just build an airport?
Excellent questions. It is extremely, extremely difficult for Palestinians to travel because they'd have nothing like a passport that's internationally recognized. So sometimes members of the business political class will often travel through Amman in many cases. That's often how they will travel. Gaza, we're talking almost nobody gets in. That's extremely, extremely difficult. So sometimes you have we're talking a handful, a small number of students who get international visas to study somewhere, a scholarship. They'll have to go to Gaza, and then often they have to travel distances, again, over the Allenby Bridge to go to Jordan and to fly. The tails are very, very challenging. So the movement is very restricted. And the Palestinians definitely would love to have an airport, and that's something that always comes up in the negotiations. As you can imagine, Israelis, especially security hawks, are not so thrilled about the idea of Palestinians having any such airport, and that's often been a sticking point that hasn't gone forward. Okay, if Naftali Bennett's plan would go forward, could they build one in A and B? Hard to say. I think that'd be part of the fine print that would be negotiated and talked about if they were to go forward with that. But yes, so travel is extremely limited for most Palestinians today.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Is it Palestinian Airlines or whatever it's called? Don't they operate out of Egypt or something like that? Or I'm not.
That's right.
Something along those lines. I'm not. We can look into that when we come
also,
back.
Steve's important point about just population. We're talking 70% of Jordan is Palestinian refugees. It's a huge dynamic in that society, and that's a big part of the calculation why they would not want to, in the current environment, I think, come up with a confederation idea. Judy.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a much more basic question. I don't understand why Bennett claims that if Israel annexes Area C and leaves A and B to be some sort of autonomous area, why that protects Israel. It just doesn't look to me like that's a good security move because of how spotty the settlements are. How spotty the area.
Yoni, maybe if you could pull up the PowerPoint for a minute to the map.
I am. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm
Thank you.
doing. Yeah.
Great. So let's look at that. That's a great, let's look at that together. And this is one map and others we can send also to look at. And if you could zoom in on the map a little bit, that would be terrific. Great. Okay. So first, let's orient ourselves to this map. The blue areas, you can see the cities of Jenin, Tulkarem, Nablus, Qalqilia, and so on, Ramallah, Jericho, Bethlehem, Hebron. The blue are the cities. The orange are Palestinian villages. So they're villages / mini suburbs in some cases of the cities. So in Bennett's plan, all those areas in blue and orange will become part of a Palestinian entity, maybe something short of a state, self-autonomous, whatever one wants to call it. That Palestinian entity would be just those orange and blue areas. So the argument from a security perspective is in part as follows, and I'll talk about the challenges because you raised some good challenges too, Judy, that others would say wouldn't be good enough. If you see all the areas in gray and trace the whole line around the West Bank, there are buffers to some degree between the Tel Aviv area, the Jerusalem area. Well, Jerusalem is more complicated, we'll come back to, and especially though if you look to the east, where the Jordan River is on the right side of the map, that big area in gray, especially in that northeast quarter, that's where some of the first settlements were built. These were built by the labor government as security settlements. Again, thinking about the history of the 48 war, the 67 war, and keeping Israel's security there. Now, of course, this is talking about conventional land warfare of the 19th and 20th centuries. In a world today of drones, in a world of all kinds of aircraft, guided missiles, there are all kinds of questions anyway, where is land enough to keep people secure? We know in this modern world, it's so much more about intelligence and satellites and the like that's going to keep one secure. So you're right to ask the question that none of these areas would get a guarantee fully from a security perspective. But the argument is, especially that eastern area near the Jordan River, for conventional warfare, the ability to have that major buffer and warning zone should a war be inflicted on Israel, again, this is through the mind of the Israeli army, the IDF, security hawks, they would have more time, ability to counter something coming from Jordan, from Iraq, from the east than they had in previous wars and conflicts. That's the argument that's made here. But again, with all the complications of 21st century warfare, that wouldn't be fully secure. I mean, you're right. You're absolutely right.
That is definitely the answer to my question. And what it says is Israel gets the cheese, the Swiss cheese, and the Palestinians get the holes.
Yeah, and a lot of people make this argument, right? And I think throughout the conflict, when I talk to my 12th grade students and others about this, there are two ways, two kind of big categories of thinking about it. Should the two states be contiguous, or do you have people stay in their particular homes and they're not contiguous, right? And the implications of each of those plans. Clearly, this is a case of not contiguous. People get to stay in their homes, but all the complications of not having a contiguous state, all the downsides, yes, it'd be incredibly complicated to how one could build a viable state out of the Swiss cheese, as you describe it. Many critics say, yeah, impossible in this case. Roberta and David, please.
I was just struck by something, and we've already discussed this. I was struck by something in the video, and it was my favorite part, this point about dismissing the international community's view. Right. Now, of course, Israelis, Jews are entitled to feel that way. What has the international community done for us? Ever. But what about them? I mean, are we saying Kaddish for the idea that the international community has any proper view? And do we really feel that it's totally irrelevant? Can we really survive by snubbing our nose, or whatever the word is, at the rest of the world?
It's an excellent question. Yeah. So I want to give some thoughts, and I would love Yoni to chime in on this one too. So the first thing to say is, well, Israel, I think, does one important thing to the international community. Its very creation. I mean, the fact that there are these November 29th, Kafteb and November streets is because of a UN partition that led to its creation. So it does have ties. And yet, there's been skepticism ever since that moment about the UN being biased against it, much of the international community being biased against it. And that's a narrative that Naftali Bennett is playing into, which is to say, we can't do things to please the rest of the world. And to use like the pejorative church, the goyim, like the non-Jews, we have to take the destiny into our own hands. That's the point of this video. That the moments in history when Jews didn't do that, it was to their peril, to their detriment. Where was the international community in the Holocaust? Where is the international community throughout history when Jews were oppressed? I mean, there's a long history narrative, arc, and argument made that this is the moment to take destiny into our own hands. And yeah, so some people be mad at us for a time, but that's not going to save Jews now. That's not going to save our destiny. We'll figure that stuff out later. It's just not the bigger priority. Of course, I don't think he would want to rip up every treaty with every country in the world, especially the United States at this moment. But a big part of Zionism and its whole deep in its ideology is Jews have to take their destiny into their own hands. They have to stop trying to appease the rest of the world. This is what keeps us secure and safe. I love your Yoni if you have other additional thoughts.
Yeah, no, I agree with you entirely. I think I would add the question I always ask when I hear lines like that: who is the audience? Who is the intended audience of a line like that? And you know, is it the international community? Is it the UN, or is it, you know, Jews, you know, from their own internal perspective? And I tend to imagine that's red meat. It feels to me like, and that in reality, when you look at Israel's standing in the world, particularly in the things we don't see very often, the behind the scenes negotiations, how, you know, what's going on with the State Department, the Foreign Ministry, et cetera, that Israel does care an awful lot about what America does and what America thinks and what the international community thinks and does, because it's in regular contact and negotiations about a host of things, you know, including, you know, trading, you know, intelligence and security and dealing with Iran and dealing with Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that there's probably more things than any of us are aware of in which Israel is behind the scenes negotiating and working together with the international and particularly the American community. So yeah, I mean, David, I think your point is really interesting and it's certainly worth our thinking about. But the reality, at least on the ground, doesn't seem to indicate that Israel actually lives that way. So I don't know if that's a helpful answer, but anyway, that's my thought on that.
I think that's right. Paula, please.
So I have a question about the map that was up just a minute or two ago.
Sure.
Was the idea that all of those, that the Palestinian autonomous area would be that all those little dots of brown would be together, or there would be Israeli settlements around every little dot of brown?
Great. So thank you. Let's go back, because that I skipped over entirely. The history of Oslo in its vision. Think of it as a vision in phases by which Palestinians would first be given ownership over areas A. Those are all the blue big cities. And once Israel and those involved in the negotiation felt a sense of trust on the security, then perhaps in all the A areas, let's say it worked out, it was secure there, then the B areas would be given over to the Palestinians. And then perhaps over time, B would become A and C would become B. Let me unpack what those things mean. Area A are areas in which Palestinians have local security service control and civilian control. Think about being the mayors, all municipal services, the schools, the water, the sewer system, the trash collection, etc. Those kind of things that mayors typically have control. That's what A would be. In area B, they would still be the mayors of these local villages in charge, but the IDF could still enter in and out, and so do to this day. In Area C, it's fully under Israeli military control of those areas. So the vision was, perhaps in a phased way over time, Area A will be areas given more autonomy to Palestinians, then Area B, and perhaps at some point B become A, by which in Area B, you'd have the local security services, the Palestinian security forces, could be in charge of Area B just as they are in A today. And then C, the bigger area, even some of that area will be turned over to Palestinian state. C would become B, B would become A, until someday almost all of it. That's the vision, which again, we've never come anywhere close to, just to name that. areas A and B have come to fruition to a certain degree, but C, nowhere close. And so, yeah, this vision, again, hasn't been realized in reality. In large, there are a lot of fingers one could point. Prime Minister Netanyahu not being interested in the 90s, the Second Intifada, and what happened, among other actors and forces.
So can I
So that's the
clarify?
basic-
So each of these little villages, or even
Yes.
even the green or blue cities, essentially would be surrounded without any continuous contact with other Palestinians by Israeli territory.
Well, that's the reality today, yes.
But even
And-
in this supposed nice plan, that
No,
would continue.
In its best, let me be clear about this. In its best, most idealistic form, the entire area, blue, orange, and gray, will be part of a future Palestinian state, maybe with a few land swaps. That was the vision that maybe that could play out. And for Palestinians, they would say that's accepting only 22% of what they consider their historic home of Palestine, that they already have made a huge compromise here. Now, again, that's if everything worked out to a T the way in which it was negotiated. But we've never come anywhere close to that vision. So again, in that vision, it will be not just the blue, not just the orange, but also the darker gray. All will be a future Palestinian state and relatively contiguous. Again, that's the Israeli argument. Now you look at some who the Palestinians have produced their vision, their map of what it looked like, the Camp David Accords in 2000. They said it was never going to be fully contiguous. There always would have been these little separations. Israel would never have given up the Jordan Valley. And some of these maps have never been declassified. So we're only going on the reports of those who are in the room, giving their impressions of what actually happened. So it's very
So
complicated.
Essentially, it's every little village can rule itself surrounded by Israelis.
Well, I think Bennett's plan, I mean, and so this is John's referring to, I think, to the larger vision of Oslo and Oslo II. And Bennett, in shrinking the conflict, is saying, no, we ain't doing that because we're annexing Area C, but we're going to find roads and bridges and ways that we can connect these, orange and blue areas so Palestinians can move freely back and forth between their villages and cities without the security checkpoints, et cetera. And so I think that's Bennett's view of it. Is
Right.
Yeah.
Not very
Yeah.
credible in my mind.
Well, credible or not, that's his view.
That's
Yeah.
fair.
Yeah.
And another visual on it, which we don't have here, but you can look up. If you look up the Trump plan that was released, also has all this vision of all kinds of crisscrossing roads connecting different areas. And again, it's very similar to what Naftali Bennett said and what Michael Goodman said, shrink the conflict. And it's clear, whatever you think of the Trump plan, that clearly they were reading the similar playbook about we're going to make this shrink the conflict argument in the kind of vision that we are putting forth. Which again, it's a non-starter today at this moment, but that was the latest plan put out. Marina.
Okay, so all these discussions are discussions about numbers.
Yes.
And square feet or kilometers or something. And there is nothing told, discussed, mentioned about the people.
Right.
The Palestinians today are treated by their neighboring Arabs and by the Israelis, even worse, but similar, as the Jews were in the 1930s. So basically they are treated as dangerous, dirty, undesirables, and that something should be done with them, put them somewhere out of sight. And nobody really wants them, and they don't want to say it. So the Palestinians, after 70 years of this, have become the Jews of the Middle East. And we are not Jews anymore. And the question is, how could in 70 years, a feeling that has been alive in us for 2000 years of being persecuted, of needing to give shelter to the stranger, of considering humanity as the core beacon of existence, just disappeared completely in the sands of Tel Aviv, just disappeared. Nobody talks about it anymore. That's my question.
Yoni, why don't you jump in first and show why you put the slide up?
Yeah, no, I was hearing in many ways the argument that is being made by those on the left side column, which is that that in the way that we, meaning the Jews and Israeli, Israel as a country, are dealing with this situation has taken away the essential Jewish nature of our state. That what it means to be Jewish to me is, a model of, prophetic Judaism, of tzedek tirdof, of pursuing justice and honoring and loving the stranger, etc. And we're not seeing that anymore. And so in the mind, and I you can correct me, Marina, if I'm reading what you're saying wrongly, but that it seems like that this is the argument that is being made by those who are saying we have to solve the conflict. Otherwise, we will no longer be a Jewish state. I don't care about like what my mother was, or whether I had a brit milah or whatever. That's not relevant in what it means to be Jewish. What it means to be Jewish is something deeper, in a sense of how I live in the world. So I at least that's what I'm hearing you say. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but how many are voicing that argument? Is it 1%? Is it 2%? Is it?
Yeah, I think it's pretty small today, and it's really been small since the Second Intifada. I think the Second Intifada, clear, you can look at the numbers there, once it ends in the mid-2000s, was a trauma for most of Israeli societies. And the fact that the labor government that Yoni showed you at the beginning, which had 44 votes out of 120, this past election cycle, people thought could have disappeared from the map entirely, could have gone out of existence, which is amazing. The founding party could have disappeared. Some people say in large part because of the disillusionment, especially of what's today the Israeli center with the peace process, because there's always been a hawkish right who has never been interested, but it's that center group who may be willing to keep the peace process alive, but take Kahol Lavan, which has become the left right. Even they are saying, if we do anything, it's going to be 20, 25 years, and they talk about divorce and separation, not peace. Most of their plans are also a similar version of shrink the conflict. That's where your Lapid is. That's where Gantz is. And those are the people, again, the center/center left. And on this, there's so many books you could read. I think one interesting one to read is Yossi Klein Halevi's book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a really interesting insight of one voice. He self-styles himself in the Israeli center, and he's of this view and really express, and he's someone who knows Micha Goodman well, and they correspond and are on panels together, etc. Is an interesting voice where he writes letters to his Palestinian neighbor, which he's now translated into Arabic for Palestinians to read, and it's gotten fascinating letters back. So it's because I wanted to tie it to your first point. We don't have enough of the Palestinian voices themselves, and you're right, they are seen as the lowest of the low within the Arab world, not just among Israelis. Without that, there would be no peace, I think, with Bahrain, the UAE, or Morocco. It's not it was a priority. It was we are not going to talk to you until you do something on this issue. That's not the reality in the Arab world today for many countries. They're interested in having relations with Israel, business, cultural ties, without dealing with the Palestinian issue. It's gone way down the radar screen because I think in part what's changed in the Arab world is the proxy fight between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And notice all the ones that have made peace with Israel are on the Saudi side, and they see Israel and Saudi Arabia coordinating to fight against Iran. That's the bigger priority today, is that dispute. The Sunni and Shia world and Iran's and its allies versus Saudi Arabia and its allies has meant different possibilities, but means the Palestinian issue has gone way down the list. For good or for bad, I mean, you could argue it many different ways if that's the right or wrong thing, but that's the current political reality and climate in which we are. Okay.
We have about 5 minutes. I don't know if we do a sprint through the.
Here's what we only have a few minutes. So I think we'll just briefly put up the slides and just show you what we had intended to do for the rest, which is okay. This you really got to the heart of the most important questions of what this class is all about. We'll just show you what else is here on these slides. The next few slides are some examples of things we've talked about in past classes. Is Naftali Bennett actually shrinking the conflict? So whether it's the 5-year plan, sending a minister to the PA to argue for funding for the Palestinians, and so on, or the Bedouin villages being recognized. The budget that we've already talked about in past classes. So that you certainly can look at on your own, and we won't review at this point. The next section are a series of future stars. I'll just say a couple quick words about things to think about. I think the biggest thing to watch is, will there be a primary in the Likud party by which Prime Minister Netanyahu gets challenged? The only declared candidate at this point is Yuli Edelstein, who used to be Speaker of the Knesset. He's probably the number one person to watch in the short term. Will this primary happen? We don't have a date yet. It'll be the next few weeks, months probably sooner rather than later, but there's no exact date. And does he have enough to overcome Prime Minister Netanyahu? If that happens, many people believe this coalition government falls apart. And a sharing agreement happens between Bennett and Likud and Gideon Sa'ar and some of the other right players. So that's the biggest story to watch. Will there be a primary? Watch for that in the coming weeks. Ayelet Shaked has been really a rising star on the right in Israeli politics. Yoni mentioned earlier the funding to Hebron. And you can read her bio more carefully later, but you can see all the things she's accomplished and done in the world. And many people think she's positioning herself to be a future challenger to lead the right, and challenger to Naftali Bennett too. Even while they've made certain moves, she's been open as a member of the government to challenge many of them. We'll go to the next. Then we have, yes, Ayman Odeh. We've talked about Mansour Abbas, but there are other Israeli Arab political leaders to watch. Ayman Odeh being among the top of them, the leader of the joint list, at one point 15 seats in the government. At one point, he could have joined a government with Benny Gantz. It's worth watching him. Will he make a move? Will he be able to be more involved in Israeli politics? I just want to, while we're on this slide, it's worth reading, thinking about this quote, which I think is a very interesting quote about the notion of shared society in Israel. This is from Ayman Odeh in his New York Times op-ed from 2019. Every time I take my youngest daughter Sham to her school, I see a passage written on the wall from the book of Psalms. The stone that the builders rejected became a cornerstone. Some may know from the Hallel prayer that we do on holidays, Even Masu Abonim Hayta Rosh Pina. The stone that was cast away becomes the cornerstone. He's making this beautiful argument that maybe Israeli Arabs can play a role in the future of a shared society. Whatever happens, a name worth watching. And we'll keep going forward. Interest of time. One last thing I have to mention for local personal interest is Michael Biton, as a member of Kachol Lavan. He's related to Michael Bonin. Some of you know who this community was, the founding board chair of our school at GAN, very involved in the Boston Jewish community for years. His cousin, Michael Biton, was the mayor of Yerucham, one of these southern development towns in the Negev, who has been, I think, a subtle, quiet, rising star because he represents those on the periphery, not in the Tel Aviv, Jerusalem area, but think about the economic concerns of Israelis. Just a name worth knowing. And for our last moment, I'll pass over to Yoni, who will show you briefly some demographic slides we have you also to consider as we close our class.
Right. So in the name of what are the political, the key issues on the political horizon that are worth looking out for, you have the rising stars, who are the players. And then, of course, as August Comte, who's one of the founders of the idea of political philosophy, famously said, demographics is destiny. So if you really want to understand what the future of any particular place looks like, follow the trends of who, whose populations are growing, whose populations are shrinking, et cetera. And so just to catch us up now, the Israeli population, and that includes Arabs and Jews, a handful of non-Arabs, and non-Jews, is about 9.327 million. That was measured on Rosh Hashanah, this most recent Rosh Hashanah. And what's significant and interesting about this is that for the first time in Israeli history, the Jewish population of Israel dipped below 74%. It's at 73.9%. And so that is a trend that will likely continue, but with an interesting twist that is worth thinking about. We're not going to get into details. Had we had more time, we could have discussed what the implications of all these numbers are, but there's just a few pieces that I think are worth looking at. So over here on the left, you could see the percentage of Jews in Israel that has been on decline since 1995. The number, though, that I think is also worth, so we just spent quite a bit of time talking about Palestinian demography, particularly Palestinian demography on the West Bank. I'll show you some numbers on that in a few minutes, but the number I really want to focus on more than anything else are the numbers that are here on this, oopsies, go back to that. There we go, that are on this slide here. So these are projections moving forward. And the column I want you to really think about here is the Haredi column as well. And because, to say that there's X percent of Jews in Israel, 74, 73, whatever percent, is only telling part of the story. Who makes up that population? And so it's not for nothing that John and I spent an entire class looking at religion and state, and particularly the role of Haredim in that. So we're talking about the ultra-Orthodox, both the both the Ashkenaz represented by United Torah Judaism and the Sephardi represented by Shas. What percent of the population are they? So you can see that in 2020, they're approximately 12.6% of the population, but they reproduce at far greater numbers. They're at somewhere roughly 6.5 children per family, whereas in the non-Haredi, in the secular Jewish world, it's approximately 2%, 2 children per family. So we're talking about way disproportionate birth rates in the Haredi community. So we're projected to have roughly 1/3 of the entire Jewish population by 2065 will be Haredi. The other number to be thinking about is the Arab population. And what's interesting when we're talking about the Arab population that are on the rise rather than on the decline. So we're talking largely, you can see they're largely staying roughly stable over the course, predicted to stay roughly stable. Who are the Arabs, or though are there subsections of Arabs that are going up or down? The Druze and the other Arab populations that are loyal to the Jewish state, that are participants in the Jewish state, are decreasing in birth rate, whereas those of the Bedouin population who tend to not be as engaged with the Jewish state are on the increase. And so when you break these numbers down, the numbers of Jews who are in the increase are the Haredim, the numbers of Arabs who are on the increase tend to be the Bedouins. So those who tend not to serve in the army, those who tend not to be as deeply as engaged in the Jewish state are on the increase. So what is that going to mean for those demographic trends? What are those going to mean for who is going to be serving in the Israeli government? Who are going to be voting for which representatives to the Knesset? Who are going to largely be the voices that are increasingly going to have representation in the government, etc.? If the Haredim continue to increase, if the Arab populations, unlike not the Jews, but others who are not as engaged, tend to increase, what is that going to mean for Israeli politics moving forward over the course of the next few decades? So I will leave it at that. We have some Palestinian numbers as well that tie into the previous conversation we'll have that you obviously we invite you to look at another time. So I see Judy, your hand has gone up. So we'll take a couple of quick questions, and then we're mindful of the time. Want to make sure that we're not keeping people.
Yes, and thank you for making another moment for this. It seems like the religion minister should be less worried about kashrut and conversion and more worried about getting the Haredim to serve in the army and to get the basic curriculum of Hebrew and maybe English and the other civics courses and so on into their school.
Well, so to that exact point, and this was another piece of John showed me the article this morning, where Mansour Abbas, who we mentioned a moment ago, has expressed his support for a bill moving forward to draft the Haredim into the army. Now, the quick backstory on that is that Naftali Bennett, the government, had basically said, we don't want to move forward with that bill unless we have total Jewish or majority of Jewish support on that. Might be shifting their view and saying, well, maybe we should move forward with it, even if we don't have majority Jewish support, and we'll do it with the majority that includes Mansour Abbas and the Ram Arab Party in that. And so why is Ram behind that is an interesting question. May have something to do with who now are trying to position themselves as loyal to the Jewish state, etc. Very interesting. But that development, to your question, just happened or was just revealed this morning. It may have happened the past couple of days, but that's on the front burner now. So a very interesting point you're making. Yes, indeed. Paula.
My comment was pretty similar. It was, so when the Haredi are 1/3 of the population and the less religious Jews are less, who's gonna fight in the army? And it may also be a factor in, I suspect the people who promote peace are more the people who fight than the people who study in the yeshiva and let other people fight.
It's a security question, and it's also, to the second point you're making, an economic question too, because the percent of Haredim who participate economically. We're talking about, in all the swaths of jobs that are necessary to make a state run. The Haredim are a much smaller percentage of that, of those groups. And so what that's going to mean economically, particularly because so many Haredim also live beneath the poverty line, and how will the state continue to support them, et cetera. Huge questions. John, you were going to jump in. Sorry, I didn't cut you off.
That's fine. No, I think these comments and questions bring us back to the beginning of the course and why it exists in the first place, which is how did we get to this cycle of 4 elections? It really is because Avigdor Lieberman was upset that more progress has not been made on this issue of Haredi being drafted into the army, based on the experience of the over 1 million Jews of the former Soviet Union who do, and who see differently the Haredim on religion and state issues. It in many ways is why we are here. That was the push that was first attempted in 2013. The 2013 government we compared to this one. And again, this government, I think it's going to be one of the big tests and the big moments if this vote will pass. So let's take one last formal comment before we close with the group. And then, of course, at least I'm happy to stay on. I don't know if you only may have to go elsewhere, but we'll take some more questions at the end for those who want to stay on. But this will be the last one. Then we'll say our thank yous and collectively let everyone go on their merry way. But Roberta and David, please.
I just wanted to add that the other issue with the Haredim is that not all of them really believe in the importance of a Jewish state.
That is true. That's been true historically. And among the younger generations, there have been some interesting trends, and they may be in directions that some of this group of others may not like, that some of the younger generations are actually not voting for UTJ and Shas. So it's been shown. Some are voting for some of the more right-wing Zionist parties, actually, which is interesting. We're talking about the Otzma Yehudit type, the really right-wing, Yamina, and among others. And that'll be interesting to notice over time that often with groups, not always do the children vote in the pattern of their parents. And we're seeing some inklings of that going forward. And we're definitely seeing some inklings to the point made earlier about the need, not just for the army, but the need for education. And someone, for example, Dov Lippman, with whom our students at GAN have met with in Israel many times, a Orthodox rabbi who moved from Baltimore. This is one of his big initiatives. He used to be in the Knesset with the Kahol Lavan party. He's made major efforts, among others, to try to increase Haredi education, because Israel knows as an economy, we'll take out the peace process on those pieces, they have to make this a productive workforce going forward. They're such a huge part of the population. I may have said this number before. In Jerusalem, 50% of kindergartners are Haredi or Israeli Arab. Therefore, to ignore these populations that won't serve in the army, won't have the connections, means you have to think out of the box about that. But with that, Yoni and I are just so appreciative and grateful we have the opportunity to spend these 5 Sundays with you and think and learn about Israeli politics. Hopefully, as any good class, we've left you with more questions than answers, ones that we have too, and we're happy, of course, to stay in touch. If you have questions for us, you're welcome to email or contact us with questions, suggestions for reading. We've given you a few today, but there are many things you can read and news sources you can follow if you want to continue with the time. So thank you very much. And I'll give Yoni a last word too of thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's a thrill every time we see an email come from Ellis saying, would you like to teach another class? John and I just love learning with all of you. Today is just yet another example of the kind of really thoughtful, engaged, and really excited conversation that really for us, I just, what a wonderful way for me to start my week is by engaging with really, really smart, thoughtful, and incredibly articulate people on an issue that matters so much to all of us. So I want to thank all of you for joining us for this most recent session, and we hope to see you again soon.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.